I think that the challenge is how do you apply that to a government system that's built on structure
structure, rules, accountability,
and red tape, and and not making dispersions, because just the sheer volume of people that you encounter in your standard Department of Corrections. How can you apply that individual concept to these mass organizations of people?
What we know about reentry programming is that it has, regardless of approach or design, it's all been pretty disappointing. And I think that's where we all need to sort of level set, is like prepare for disappointment. And no matter what you're trying to do, prepare to be disappointed. And then if you aren't, great. But so that's the way I feel about this idea as well, is like, I think we need experimentation. I think we need to get out of a reliance upon the methods that have already been demonstrated not to work. Right? We already have the evidence that it's not working, or it may be making things slightly worse in a way that we're behaving toward people who are in prison. So I wouldn't suggest to anybody that you try to do this at scale. I would say pick a couple institutions at states, really. I think you need buy-in from the governor to the head of the Department of Corrections, to the head of the individual facility, to all of the staff that you would be drawing into a project like this. And everybody has to be on board, because it's going to be really, really hard, even if they are on board. This is not easy work. And then you try it with those conditions, you try it in a few places, evaluate it. Is it helpful? Did people run off with the money? And try to just, determine, does this hold promise? If it doesn't, out the window and start over again. What we can't afford to do in this country is to continue to invest in approaches that just don't work or may make things worse, because the public will ultimately get tired of that and say, the one thing that we do get a return on is long prison sentences that take people off the streets and, help to drive down the rate of criminal activity. We've seen a massive fall off in criminal activity since the 1990s. And most of the studies suggest that about a quarter of that is due to how many people we put in prison. So it does have an effect. You can get something as a society out of that approach.
Yeah, but the flip side to that coin is it's not exactly sustainable as a tax-paying citizen, right? The rate of incarceration and the cost of incarceration kind of make it a really expensive, effective tool, right?
Right. It's something like $1 trillion a year is what we're spending and losing as a result of the way that we do incarceration in this country. That's a lot of money, even by today's standards. $1 trillion a year. There's a lot of other things we can do with that $1 trillion, both as a society and as taxpayers who would prefer to see their money going to something more productive than warehousing people behind bars. So I'm on board with the idea that it's an expensive proposition to incarcerate people. But if your option is spend that money on incarceration and have a safer community, or throw the money away on programs that don't work and have a more dangerous community, I'll take I think the public, the prisons, that's that actually, I think it, at least psychologically, it may not bear out in the math with research, but psychologically it meets the public where they are, which is, I want a safe community. I want my kids to be safe.
Yeah.
And I can't really blame people for feeling that way.
I do kind of, in that vein, want to circle back to a couple of statements that you made. One being that, you know, corrections tends to be risk averse, right? That we tend to plan for the worst case scenario, and that we need innovation and experimentation. So how do we reconcile that a little bit, yeah, right? Because the natural inclination is to say, well, this is new, I'm not wanting to take the risk. How do you think? How would you counsel somebody to reconcile that?
So, I mean, it goes back to what I said about how I would approach trying to conduct this experiment that I'm talking about, which is that you have to start with leadership. You have to have leadership all the way down from top to bottom in these institutions that is willing to kind of hold hands and jump off that cliff together. I think you should have the police force. I think you should have probation. I think you should have the prosecutors, so that it's harder when things go wrong, and they will go wrong. People will get hurt.
Yeah.
That there are fewer fingers being pointed. Like, I told you, it's like,
gotcha.
I think that's really critical, because the political benefits to failure, or the political costs of failure, are enormous when something goes wrong. When somebody gets killed or hurt, that's why. And people are so risk averse in the correction system, is that, there are lives in the balance.
Failure,
and careers are in the
failure
balance
is not an option. Yes.
Yeah. So the easy response is, don't do anything. Just still water is what we want. Just don't mess. And so, I mean, we've been trying to do a project for the last couple of months of just trying to interview people who are behind bars and their experience with the COVID pandemic. I cannot believe how hard it is just to get in touch with people who are in prison. I mean, it is, there are so many checks on who's talking to whom and how and when, and all that's there for a reason. It's not just, wanting to make other people's lives miserable. It's all there for a reason. And I think that is a reflection of this overly controlling mentality that really inhibits this personal agency that I was talking about. The whole system is primed against it.
Yeah, I will say that's, I had never thought about it in the way that you had presented it earlier, where some of these early intervention programs almost remove that sense of personal agency, because it's really a controlled environment, right? In order to stay in this program, you have to do this. And so you really have someone else making decisions for you. I'd never really thought about it that way, but it makes sense in leading up to, as you called, the penultimate structured environment that is prison. And so there, it is a challenge, right? When you're breaking a years-long pattern of behavior in just handing somebody freedom, freedom of choice. Of course, they're going to crave the structure. Of course, they're going to go back. So it's just really interesting. I'd never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, because we, for kind of average middle class people in this country, we're kind of raised up into a set of expectations about life, for whom, for us, that it's just a very alien way of thinking. Like, what if you from the moment you were born, you were in a sort of a chaotic environment where nothing was reliable, where parents weren't fully engaged, where schools didn't work. and then you have, you start acting up, and all of a sudden you've got the schools on you, and then you've got the cops on you, and then you've got community supervision on you. It's like you can't win for losing, and you are not being brought up into kind of an understanding of the world, that you have choices, that you have freedom, and that there's going to be institutions and people around you that are going to support you in those things. So yeah, I just think it's kind of a duh thing. It's like, of course,
yeah.
if that were your life experience, why would you behave in any other way than the way that we see people who are involved in the criminal justice system behave?
It's funny. And the interesting fact about me is I'm from inner city Baltimore. So
yeah,
I grew up in one of those neighborhoods, and it's really interesting for me to think back through, moments in my life where I may have been given the benefit of the doubt, and somebody else wasn't, whether it was because of, the color of my skin, or because, I come from it was a sort of a fractured home at first, but later on a 2-parent home, right? And so that it kind of leads me into my next topic and question, right? The study that you issued was done in January of 2020, is that correct? Or December of 2019? So right before our world changed quite radically, right? So I imagine that you've been having some additional conversations in relation to the study through, the social justice movement, through the pandemic. Is there anything that you're sort of rethinking about this study, or some new knowledge that you have that might have changed your approach, or some of the conclusions that you would have drawn?
Well, we've had, obviously, the pandemic is kind of another 9/11 event in life for me, just in terms of everything came to a screeching halt, and we all started marching in a different direction, trying to think about COVID and its effect on prisons and employment, and all sorts of things like that. We will get back to this, and then we've also had a presidential election, and that's going to have a significant impact. We're launching a new initiative with the Brookings Institution, which is another DC think tank, which is actually just around the corner from our offices. We're kind of we're both institutions are basically in the same block. And AEI is a center-right organization. Brookings is a center-left organization. And we're putting together another working group of scholars. And we're assembling a package of recommendations for the Biden administration and for Congress on kind of where the low-hanging fruit is in criminal justice reform, where are the consensus items that there's a majority of opinion behind them, like these things definitely need to be done. President Biden has been involved in this issue for a long time. He understands it very well. I think he's got some regrets about the 1994 crime bill that he'd like to address. And so I think there's going to continue to be movement on this. And what we want to do with that working group is to give them, again, stay rooted in that bipartisan thing that we talked about at the beginning, but present to the administration and to Capitol Hill, okay, do these things because that's what the evidence tells us. It needs to be done. So that group is just starting right now, just putting these essays together. And then we'll probably continue with that group over the next couple of years to provide a kind of backstop resource to weigh in on other topics that we didn't address as they emerge. There are I think, a handful of these sort of top tier consensus items, and then there's a lot of smaller issues that need to be dealt with that we won't try to address up front. So this group would kind of be on call to be thinking about those challenges, writing about them. And then with respect to rethinking reentry, my plan a year ago was that we would invite corrections teams from around the country, do some regional meetings with government officials and corrections officials to kind of walk them through the findings and see if we could identify a state or two where the leadership is in place that would be interested in be willing to take on this project, to assume the risks that are involved in it, and then see if we could get it implemented in a couple places.
If you don't mind me asking, one of the things that I read in your Rethinking Reentry was about the role that risk assessments play in it. That I think you said that they're a vital component to effective reentry. This has gotten a little pushback in light of, some of the social justice stuff in regards to equalness of opportunity and some of the risk assessment tools. What are your thoughts? Are your thoughts still the same on, the need for risk assessment tools as part of a program?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the program that I was talking about, that I kind of thought through, the role that I see for risk assessment is in providing some sort of an objective benchmark for understanding the risks that a particular incarcerated person faces when they exit. So that's sort of one role, is like, they will have ideas. Everybody's got ideas about what they want their life to be. And we want to surface that. We want to make that the main thing. Then we want to wrap around that kind of, okay, you want to get a bachelor's degree and open a business. That's where you would like to go, right? But we see here, looking at your risk assessment, that you've got a substance abuse challenge. You've got no stable housing, and you've got these other 3 or 4 things that are triggers for you. They're the kind of things that are going to, if you stumble over them, you're going to wind up back in here. So how are we going to compensate for that to allow you to get to the thing that you actually want? So in other words, don't make everything about the deficits, but at least you need to be aware of what the deficits are, and what you're trying to leverage is their capacities and their interests. And so that's kind of the role that I see for risk assessments. That's one of the roles. The second is, I do think that risk assessments can tell us something, if not the current risk assessments, maybe risk assessments in the future that could be developed that would help to tell us who's really on this pathway of desisting from criminal activity. Who's on the cusp. A lot of people leave prison and never come back. They have the experience, they're done. Right? They don't need our help. Then you've got another group that is not ready to change. They're just not ready. And then you've got a bunch of people in the middle, I think, that are like on the cusp of, maybe I'm ready to try something different than what I was doing that landed me inside this facility. And I think that a risk assessment tool that could help us understand who might be on that cusp would be something that would be really, really useful. So really looking at agency rather than risk. So it's the flip of that.
It's almost, instead of a filtering mechanism, it's trying to find inhibitors to success, right? That you're really using it as you're really focusing from a standpoint of this person is going to be successful, instead of using the risk assessment to say they're not going to be successful. They're going to be successful. Now, what risks are going to inhibit them from achieving that success? So you're right. Yeah, it's almost the inverse of how they're currently used today in a lot of situations.
And I don't think you can emphasize this too strongly. We have a very punitive approach to criminal justice.
Yes, I know that very well.
Yeah, right. So some of this, there needs to be a little bit of a cognitive shift among the people who run that system to say, do we really need to approach every individual as kind of a statistical package of risk, rather than having mechanisms for understanding more about who they are and making informed decisions about whether there's something there that we can work with or not. So it's a deeply ingrained culture in our correction system. It would take a long time to change, if it ever changes. But again, we can either do that hard work, or we can just keep doing what we're doing, which isn't working.
Yeah, I think to steal a line from your article, that the bottom line is status quo is neither sufficient or sustainable. Yeah. And for the sake of thousands of men and women who return from prison each week, and families and communities who receive them, we can and must do better. I could not echo that sentiment anymore. That there's a large swath of people who are people who we should care about the outcome, not just for public safety, but as well as the social side, that we as a society are progressing, right? One of my favorite sayings is all activity, no movement. And it would seem that your study kind of supports that there's been a lot of activity in the reentry space, but not a lot of movement. And so the challenge I think that you and I face is how do we generate and how do we create some movement? So with that, I'll thank you for your time, and thank you for the conversation. Really appreciate it. But I'm a bit of a storyteller. I love to tell and listen to stories. So I'll ask, from all of your travels, all of your talking with individuals or agencies, do you have a story to tell about, maybe something that's going right?
Oh, something going right. Yes, there's so much happening in the correction space that I personally derive a lot of hope from. One of the things that I find most hopeful, because it fits so well with this agency issue that I'm interested in, I always keep telling people it's agency, not agencies. We need to promote agency, not agencies. Yes. And I've been really taken with some of the efforts going on around the country around providing opportunities to people who are incarcerated to pursue undergraduate education. There's the BARD Prison Initiative up in New York. It's fantastic. And there's a three-part Netflix series on a documentary on this. Really highly recommend that if people want something that's inspiring about change that's going on within institutions, within individual lives, and how helping prisoners to develop a more self-reflective approach to life may be a huge key for many of them to avoid recidivism. I find that fascinating. There's another program out in Washington State called the Prison Scholars Fund that provides grants to prisoners so that they're able to to pursue a degree while they're in prison. It's run by a guy who went to prison, got his degree behind bars. Wonderful guy. Dirk Van Velsen is his name, Prison Scholars Fund. So those are the kind of things that I really derive a lot of hope from, because I see this mechanism of change that I'm convinced is the one that's going to make the difference.
Because I love to see and hear those stories of hope too. It kind of keeps me going every day. So thank you again for your time. Thank you again for sharing a little bit about your work and a little bit about yourself. And thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.